My name is Jock McLane, and I'm Associate Dean for Faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm here tonight in place of one of two people, neither of whom could come. Sarah Mangelsdorf, the Dean of the College, was very sorry she wasn't able to come. Dan Linzer also expressed his regrets about not being able to come due to scheduling conflict. So I want to welcome you on this occasion, the installation of Christopher Herbert as the Chester D. Tripp Professor of the Humanities. I'm especially pleased that the role of introducing Chris has fallen to me. Chris is a very dear friend of long standing. Our fates have crisscrossed over more than a couple of decades. We were involved as the masters of the same residential college. He was my associate dean when I was chair, and I was his associate dean earlier than he was chair. And we survived both of those occasions. I've known how Chris has approached the shared or common life of the college with seriousness of purpose, with grace, with good judgment. Beyond the college and the university, we have also shared many things. We have played tennis together, we have birded together, we have eaten together, we've even had a couple of drinks together. We puzzled over India together more recently. So this occasion gives me really a very great pleasure. Before I call on Jules Law to introduce Chris, I want to remind you that there will be a reception immediately after Chris's lecture, and that reception will be upstairs in the Hagstrom, second floor of this building. And before calling on Jules Law to introduce Chris, I want to say a few words about Chester Tripp and this chair that Chris is about to inhabit. Chester Dudley Tripp he went to Yale University and studied some kind of science. He became a mining and metallurgical engineer, as well as an economic and industrial consultant. He began his career working in the mines in Minnesota, and then moved to Chicago in a less hands-on position as an executive in a series of metal companies and mining companies. He was involved in television and many different kinds of businesses, in addition to metal, to mining. He published a journal called the Economic Trend Lines, a marketing forecasting service. He didn't have an intimate relationship with Northwestern, interestingly. It's not clear to me how he came to but he did live in Chicago. He did eventually end up living in Evanston, and he did make this gift to Northwestern, a small part of which went to the medical school library, the larger part endowed the chair that Chris will now inhabit. He was a serious art collector. He collected many objects and donated some of them to the Art Institute of Chicago. In fact, I looked up today and I found 51 objects in their collection that he either donated wholly or gave money to the Art Institute to purchase. He had also a serious interest in education. He endowed similar chairs at both Yale and the University of Chicago, and also a chair at Berea College. Let me call upon Jules Law to come forward. And after Jules introduces Chris, I'm going to adorn Chris with the medal. So Jules Law, a colleague in the English department, professor of comparative and English and comparative literature, but also currently the Charles Dury McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence, one of a series of teaching awards that Jules has held.
Thank you, John. I can't begin to express what a pleasure this is for me.
For more than 20 years, Chris Herbert has been my ideal colleague in every sense. A model scholar, model chair, model dean. His combined record as a scholar, as a teacher, and as an administrator is unparalleled, I think, at any university in the country. Jock has already spoken to Chris's extraordinary record as an administrator, chair of the English department from 1990 to 1993, again from 1999 to 2000, associate dean of the college from 1993 to 1998, chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, but not many of you knew that, from 2002 to 2004. His Portuguese wasn't great, but his yet despite reluctantly giving up the better part of 15 years of his career to administration, and I know how deeply reluctant a sacrifice this was on his part and how much it was done in a sense of duty to the institution. Chris also found time to win the College of Arts and Science Distinguished Teaching Award 2 times. He's actually the only 2-time winner I know of. And as well to win 3 major national fellowships for his scholarship. It's that scholarship that I want to talk just a little bit about today. Many years ago, over 20 to be inexact, I was pursuing research in London, England. I have to say that because there's a London, Canada. And I came across an 1865 article in the Illustrated London News reporting the recent discovery of the source of the Nile. And what the article said, more or less verbatim, was that for all those who had become accustomed to hear in recent years that British imperialism was little more than a tawdry tale of commercialism, hollow jingoism, and chauvinistic aggrandizement, the discoveries of Livingstone and Speke and Burton must surely be a source of profound admiration. Here the newspaper proclaimed were humane, scientific, genuinely altruistic discoveries that ought to make any citizen proud. Now this article discomfited me to no end, though not yet having read the books Chris Herbert was to write over the next couple of decades. I could not quite explain why. The history seemed to me to be backwards. Surely, I thought, a skeptical critique of imperialism and cynicism about Victorian moral ideals could not themselves have been Victorian commonplaces. Such deconstructions surely were our own distinctively modern contribution to intellectual and cultural history. The Victorians were complacent. It's we who are skeptical. Suffice it to say that Chris Herbert's entire career, stretching over a series of landmark critical studies, has been a monumental revision of this idea of the Victorian. To borrow a key Herbertian critical term, and I think this will give Chris pleasure, it has been a career dedicated in the most serious and productive sense to laceration. Not only to the laceration of many contemporary critical and ideological shibboleths, but more importantly to the rigorous analysis of the self-laceration at the heart of Victorian culture, a culture which, until Herbert's work, we have understood very imperfectly, even as we have paid it dubious tribute of imitation. In a series of idiosyncratic and revisionary milestone studies of comedy, of ethnography, of relativism, of imperialism, Herbert has remapped the Victorian landscape, which is to say the landscape of we other Victorians. Each of these books, Trollop and Comic Pleasure in 1987, Culture and Anomie in 1991, Victorian Relativity in 2001, and War of No Pity in 2008. Each of these books examines a key chapter in Victorian intellectual and cultural history, reading it alongside an important strain of late 20th century scholarship, thus Victorian ethnography alongside cultural studies, Victorian relativism alongside post-structuralism, imperialism alongside post-colonial studies. Probing in this way the genealogy of our contemporary intellectual and scholarly landscape, Herbert has rewritten both Victorian and contemporary intellectual history. It sounds too easy to say that he's revealed the Victorians to be more modern than we've recognized, and we moderns more Victorian than we care to acknowledge, but this is in fact just what he's done. Let's take, just very briefly, relativism. We know it most famously as a theory of physics propounded by Einstein. More recently, and perhaps more relevantly, as a theory of culture, actually, according to Herbert, as the very definition of that culture concept. But what wasn't at all legible before the publication of Victorian Relativity, and what makes the relationship between scientific and cultural relativism more than just a casual historical analogy, was just how profoundly relativistic thought permeated and characterized liberal and relativistic thought by name, not just the kind of spirit, but by name, characterized liberal intellectual circles in the middle of the 19th century. And even more startlingly, how deeply skeptical the most progressive Victorian scientists and political thinkers were of the strain of positivism which ran through Victorian culture and which we think of as essentially Victorian. This is not to say that Herbert finds in the Victorian period the genesis of our own progressive political sensibilities. True, he traces cultural relativism back to the Victorians, and specifically to Victorian science, thus dispelling the either comforting or embarrassing presumption that it's a concept of more recent provenance. But Herbert is laceratingly clear about the deeply self-contradictory nature of cultural relativism, a concept at once inimical and necessary to our sense of social justice and of the possibility of positive political claims. It would be fair to say that his work warns us everywhere against the assumption that intellectual and political positions map onto one another in any simple way. He relentlessly scrutinizes the complex psychic underpinnings of moralism, while ever alert to the way in which such relentless critique has tended historically to breed its own pieties in turn. He has spent a lifetime showing how rigorously the most advanced Victorian thinkers dedicated themselves to criticizing dogmatism, whether the dogmatism of utilitarianism, of positivism, or religiosity, and how consistently they attempted to make this criticism the grounds of social critique. But of course, with Herbert, there's always one more turn of the screw. Rather than showing us that Victorian intellectuals were the heroic precursors to our own pantheon of heroic demystifiers, he shows us that we are heirs alike of Victorian positivism and Victorian relativism, of the injunction to be holistic and the contradictory injunction to be inductive. And he shows us that each of these strains of thinking had then, as they have now, well understood ideological connotations and political affiliations. Our conventional understanding of the Victorian moral life world, and of the genealogy connecting us to it, so oversimplifies these complex dynamics as to be grotesque. But it is compensated for by the extraordinary intellectual adventure and the sheer aesthetic pleasure of the bracing encounter with Chris Herbert's writing. And this is an adventure and a pleasure that I won't defer any further. So put on your seatbelts. After a brief wardrobe enhancement, Chris Herbert will finally be taking direct aim at the cultural formation he's been shadowing for a lifetime, Victorian religion.
Before I put this on, I want to warn Chris that just 12 years ago, Homi Baba down in Hyde Park also had this chair, the chair of some name, honored. In the following year, he was honored with the worst writer of profession.
Much more fun than I expected. What makes it so much fun, of course, is apart from being able to listen to one of Jules's wonderful introductions. Jules has such a gift for making people's work sound more interesting than they ever have been in reality. But it's, first of all, to have this occasion presided over by two such old and good friends as Jock and Jules are, and to share it with an audience of so many other old friends, good friends within and without Northwestern, so many of the great colleagues whom it's my almost incomprehensible privilege to be able to spend my professional life among, and a good number of my terrific students also I see around the room. It's a great pleasure. Anyway, thanks to you all for coming. It's really a treat for me to see you all here. I won't take time to mention people individually now, but I did just want to say to my son Stefan and his soon-to-be bride Stephanie, who came in from Tucson for this event. How lovely it is to have them in the audience. I wanted also to thank Estelle Yours, there she is, of the Dean's Office for all she's done in expertly engineering this occasion. I'm really grateful for that, Estelle. And thanks finally also to my wife, Bernadette, who gave me much good advice about not obsessing more than necessary about this lecture. And who I think is personally responsible for posting about half of the posters you may have seen. Nice to think that she'll now be able to return to her normal activities. As for my lecture today, what you're about to hear is my first attempt to derive something presentable from a new research project that's still, I will confess at the outset, in a rather nebulous state. I always feel nervous doing this, so I hope you'll give me lots of positive reinforcement when I get it on. My project takes as its point of departure the well-established standard narrative of Victorian cultural history, which portrays the 19th century British frame of mind, particularly the culturally dominant middle-class frame of mind, as the historical derivative of the great wave of neo-Calvinistic religious revivalism that swept the country in the second half of the 18th century, first under the auspices of the Methodists, John and Charles Wesley and their colleague George Whitefield, and that then mutated in the 1790s into the more socially upscale evangelical movement, properly so called, under the leadership of William Wilberforce and Hannah More and others. The scale and depth of the transformation that the national mentality underwent in these decades was evident, were evident to contemporaries. As early as 1820, Robert Southey declared that John Wesley had enacted nothing less than, quote, one of the great moral and intellectual revolutions of history. It's the moral revolution, a phrase that's ubiquitous in the scholarly literature on this subject, that particularly concerns me, as it has particularly concerned a long string of cultural historians. The latter have pretty uniformly scripted the developments of this era as a national conversion narrative, and have agreed as to the profundity, if not necessarily the attractiveness or the desirability of the change produced in the British psyche and in British social life by the advent of the new puritanical moral regime that in some ways came to its fullest fruition in the mid-Victorian decades. Quoting here, the evangelical movement transformed the whole character of English society and imparted to the Victorian age that moral earnestness which was its distinguishing characteristic, writes one scholar, encapsulating the standard view. The distinguished social historian and our former Northwestern colleague, the late Harold Perkin, spells out this thesis with much persuasive illustrative detail, crediting the influence of evangelicalism for what he too calls, in the much used phrase, the moral revolution that remade 19th century England. The evangelical revival answered, quote, the middle class demand for a new and higher morality in the previously dissolute, morally dissolute nation, says Perkin, in language that's echoed by many another scholar. Now, I don't seek to cast doubt on this scenario of the religious origins of the Victorian moral ideology. On the contrary, I believe it's important for Victorian literary studies in particular to emphasize more strongly than they ever yet have the influence of Calvinistic and crypto-Calvinistic revivalism across a broad spectrum of 19th century writing. That this was an influence fraught with certain crucial contradictions inherent in its theological origins only seems to have rendered it all the more potent, all the more irresistible for its 19th century players. But if my own experience is any indication, anyone who immerses him or herself a bit in the foundational texts of the pre-Victorian revival movements is in for a surprise, one that may feel like a revelation, and it may seem to call, after all, for rethinking the received verities concerning cultural change in the long 19th century in England. Latter-day scholarship on the evangelical movement and its aftermath seems to be oblivious to this fact, but what one can quickly discover from the canonical writings of the Wesleys and Whitefield and Wilberforce and others is that the great revival movement over which they presided and which has passed in the eyes of posterity for a call to moral renewal was very much not a movement aimed at promoting, in Harold Perkins' phrase, a new and higher morality in England. It was, in fact, something very like the opposite. Almost the cardinal doctrine of Methodist and evangelical ideologues was, in fact, the denunciation of the ideal of moral virtue itself as a uniquely dangerous delusion which pious folk should shun. They despised, or said they did, the values commonly taken to constitute Christian ethics, and sought not to reinforce or purify these values, charity and benevolence and mercy and forgiveness and so forth, but rather to discredit and actually, as far as possible, to abolish them in the name of the revival of religion. Their view was that this revival could only occur once the propensity of English people to idealize humanitarian morality had been entirely negated, or, to use a characteristically violent phrase of John Wesley's, trampled underfoot. You may be thinking that this must be some kind of hyperbole on my part, but no principle is more vehemently or more insistently proclaimed in this literature than this antagonism to the ideal of morality. Hannah More states it in its weak form when she declares that, quote, morality is but an empty name if it be destitute of the principle and power of Christianity. Morality for its own sake, morality not expressly and exclusively set under the sign of religious proselytizing, or morally good conduct on the part of a non-evangelical, is, she says, entirely worthless. But she and her fellow revivalists meant something much more than just this. They meant that morality, both in the sense of a system of ideal values and in the sense of virtuous personal conduct, was nothing less than the antithesis and the rival, the mortal adversary, the subverter of Christian faith. It was the credo of the enemies of God. This point is of such importance for historical understanding that it needs, I think, to be placed in the foreground of 19th century cultural studies, even at the risk of introducing confusion into the standard historical narrative that I began by tracing. It's true that, strictly speaking, no abolition of the misguided English cult of moral virtue is necessary or possible, since, according to the revivalists' core doctrine, no such thing as moral virtue or philanthropic sympathy exists or possibly can exist on earth. Evangelical theology, as its foundational act, strikes down moral virtue by decree, beginning, as it does, with the principle of original sin and the complete hopeless depravity of mankind. Human nature is, quote, totally corrupted in all its faculties, unquote, by divine dictate, declares John Wesley, speaking for the revival movement as a whole. The preachers and writers I've mentioned vie with one another in producing rhetoric lurid enough to depict the moral barrenness of the world and the unredeemed baseness of humanity under the curse of original sin. Wesley, in particular, traffics throughout his career in hair-raising invective of this kind, invective that forms an important element in his partly submerged legacy to the Victorian imagination. Quoting here, our body, soul, and spirit are infected, overspread, consumed with the most fatal leprosy, he declares in one characteristic passage. We are all over, within and without, in the eye of God, full of diseases and wounds and putrefying sores. Every one of our brutal passions and diabolical tempers, every kind of sensuality, pride, selfishness, is one of those deadly wounds, of those loathsome sores full of corruption and of all uncleanness. A reader not under the spell of religious enthusiasm, but who does Wesley the justice of supposing him to mean exactly what he says, can hardly fail to take a passage like this as evidence that the Wesleyan Revolution takes some of its galvanizing energy from what can only be called a very severe and obviously highly contagious psychotic disorder. It's apparent at all events that if embracing this starkly nihilistic vision of human life is, as Wesley declares it is, the sine qua non of genuine piety, then any appeal to or belief in human virtue can only be at best nonsensical and at worst a snare of the devil. The principal dogma of Methodist and evangelical theology is therefore, as you know, that salvation from the eternal flames comes only from the action of unmerited divine grace and not from so-called good works performed by an individual. The preachers speak with detestation of this horrid anti-Christian notion of good works. It's a doctrine with major consequences for the evangelical personality, to the extent that hating so intensely the corrupt theology of good works leads inevitably not only to a certain religious gourmandise for signs of human vice and depravity, but in fact to hatred of good works themselves and of those who perform them. In the head-spinning logic of Calvinistic fundamentalism, a morally worthy action, or even a single good intention, were such a thing possible, which if not, would be a defiance of God. Wesley and the other preachers certainly exhibit this always contradiction-infested thinking in the warnings they regularly deliver to their congregations against the seductive heresy of good works and against their authors. Even, or even especially, the most admirable seeming citizens, Wesley feels it imperative to insist, quote, are all unholy and sinful themselves, and void of any single grain of goodness. Only corrupt fruit grows on a corrupt tree, he declares, and the heart of the virtuous man is altogether corrupt and abominable. The deepest drives of the Methodist evangelical psyche are clearly on view in these slanders constantly directed by the preachers at worldly people of virtue. Not, nota bene, at the hypocrite who counterfeits virtue as a mask for vice, but rather at that far more dangerous type, the genuinely morally exemplary person, whom Wesley and the others take it as perhaps their most urgent mission to vilify. Wesley thus declares that pious Christians should feel not admiration, but disgust and aversion toward the man who, quote, has done much good, is wise or learned or honest and morally good, esteemed of men and of a fair reputation. These are all in Wesley's upside-down lexicon terms of scorn. However highly esteemed among men such a Christian as this may be, he is, Wesley announces approvingly, an abomination in the sight of God. Such a man within is full of all filthiness. That last word captures all the nauseated revulsion with which Wesley is stricken in the presence of that impossible thing, human virtue. To attain a devout spirit, he says elsewhere, we need as the first step to cast off what he calls in biblical language the filthy rags of our own righteousness. Do not suppose, he says, that honesty, justice, and whatever is called morality is religion. Before attaining the full Christian spirit, says George Whitefield in just the same vein, quote, you must not only be made sick of your original and actual sin, but you must be made sick of your righteousness. You must be brought to see that all your duties, all your righteousness, be filthy rags, a menstruous cloth, that God hates them. To judge from all this phobic sermon literature, God hates and loathes righteousness far more intensely than he hates sin. Hence, Whitefield's denunciation of his Methodist rivals, the so-called Arminians, Wesley's party, who, as he writes, because they would appear friends to morality, unquote, allegedly reject the doctrine of salvation by grace on the grounds that such theology is destructive of good works and can lead to immoral behavior. That is, he accuses the Arminians of nourishing a covert sympathy for that repulsive thing that God hates, morality. In reality, Satan himself is the author of the despicable false doctrine that salvation is contingent upon morality and good works, says Whitefield. He's using Arminianism here as a polemical straw man, to be sure, since the Arminian Wesley, in fact, is fully as violent in anathematizing the worship of morality and good works as Whitefield himself, as we've seen. This same dogma then becomes the basis of Wilberforce's extended critique of what he calls again and again mere morality, and which, like Whitefield, he declares to be peculiarly dangerous to the cause of religion and a principal catalyst of what he calls infidelity. There is, he warns, a difference, even a contradictory relation between Holy Scripture and mere morals based on what he sneeringly calls the commonly received maxims of the Christian world, and that he derides elsewhere as a contemptible system of gospel morality and moral precepts. He means by this such popular precepts as, say, "'Tis more blessed to give than to receive," or "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One result of the tendency to exalt moral precepts like these, says Wilberforce, has been a severe distortion of national values, such that actions, in his words, merely injurious to society, such as murder, theft, and fraud, have come to be wrongly considered more serious and more to be punished by law than actions offensive to God, such as idolatry, irreligion, swearing, or sensuality. One may notice Wilberforce's special animus surprising in a world-famous philanthropist against benevolence and philanthropic motives generally. Hence, his slur against the professions of, quote, love towards their fellow creatures, unquote, often made by those he insultingly calls nominal Christians. These professions always, he asserts, are false and corrupt, except in the case of born-again evangelicals like himself. Later, he vents his contempt for what he strikingly calls the senseless cant of charity, often professed in modern England. It's a sign of the spiritual turpitude of the times, he declares, that, quote, "For the last 50 years, the press has teemed with moral essays," unquote, that fail to insist on the all-importance of religion, and thus help to generate what he calls the declension of Christianity into a mere system of ethics. I conclude from all this that in considering the origins of the so-called moral revolution of Victorian and pre-Victorian England, we need to bear in mind what these statements tell us. First, that the transformative modern movement of benevolence and philanthropy and moral uplift was long since underway in England, when the evangelicals, who commonly are given all the credit for it, came on the scene. And that their moral revolution was actually conceived by them as a counter-revolution, directed precisely against its movement and against its devotion to the ideology of good works that they despised. Their mission, let me repeat, was nothing less than to render English moral culture null and void, so as to set sectarian religion in its place. That this was so may have fallen victim to the amnesia of perhaps the willed forgetting of a century or so of historical scholarship, but it was unmistakable to contemporary critics, who often call for resistance to what they judged to be a malignant and essentially subversive development. Thus, the Reverend Robert Fellows, in his 1801 tract entitled Religion Without Cant, to mention just one of these numerous critics, indicts Wilberforce specifically for the disastrous moral nihilism that Fellows declares to be inherent in evangelical teaching. He gives in the process a concise summation of the themes I've been tracing. Quote, "As the notions of original sin, which are entertained by the fanatics, invalidate the moral government of God, they must, of course, take away all motives to righteousness," he declares. "If God be not a moral governor, he must be a careless spectator of human actions, indifferent to vice and virtue. And hence, mankind could cherish no hope of conciliating his favors and need entertain no dread of exciting his displeasure." Unquote. This specter of a Christian God, void of moral principles, callously indifferent to events in the human world, is the one, as Fellows clearly saw, that haunted the whole enterprise of evangelical proselytizing. The evangelicals, he explains in an earlier pamphlet, teach that, quote, the effusion of Christ's blood upon the cross hath annulled the necessity of moral observances, and that the reciprocal and unchangeable obligations of truth, of justice, and humanity, unquote, have been brought into disrepute by the recent successes of what he calls this loathsome and pernicious doctrine. The relation between the revival of religious fundamentalism and the Victorian and pre-Victorian moral revolution seems, in other words, in light of the materials I've been describing, ever less like a straightforward equation and ever more like a riddle, one that might, as I said, require reinterpretation of a great deal of what we think we know about this period. Might the moral revolution that expressed itself, among other ways, in the moral didacticism of high Victorian popular fiction, conceivably be better understood, not, after all, as signaling the cultural dissemination of that somewhat oxymoronic thing, evangelical morality, but rather as a massive cultural reaction against the Methodist and evangelical influence. It would be too much to hope that 19th century literary history could ever furnish a definite answer to such a question. Allow me to speculate briefly, nevertheless, about what I'm convinced is a deep connection between the religious trends that I've been tracing and the literary movement that coincides exactly, chronologically speaking, with the rise of middle and upper class evangelicalism in the 1790s, the so-called Gothic romance. By deep, I mean a connection that powerfully manifests itself throughout Gothic writing, though without necessarily advertising itself in a readily legible form, or even, for all I know, being precisely intelligible at every moment to Gothic novelists themselves or to their readers. The formula around which the classic Gothic novel revolves is the fable of the terrifying persecution of virtue as embodied in the all too desirable form of a high-minded heroine by the perverted villain who goes under such names as Manfred, Montoni, Ambrosio, or Melmoth. The many redactions that this fable undergoes in the late 18th and early 19th centuries are laden with religious references that seem designed to hint to a reader sensitive to them that the theme of panicky dread that defines these stories may ultimately have as much to do with religious as with sexual pathologies. This could only mean, at the cusp of the 19th century, that Gothic horror fiction manifests in its special constellation of imagery the widely shared sense that England, in this age of religious enthusiasm, was increasingly exposed to a lethal threat from the frightening psycho-ideological syndrome that anti-evangelicals at the time called fanaticism. The figure that most vividly connects contemporary religious debate, where it appears in explicit form, to contemporary popular literature, where it appears most of the time only in allegorically coded form, is the figure of God shedding his mask of benignity and mercy and revealing himself suddenly in the guise of a diabolical monster. The theological name for the mentality that this figure exemplifies is antinomianism, the heretical doctrine which the Methodists and evangelicals were understandably often accused of holding, that the heretical doctrine that the moral law doesn't apply to God's elect, or by extension, to God himself. We just encountered one definitive version of the antinomian devil deity, Robert Fellowes' image of an evangelical God who is indifferent to vice and virtue, and, as Fellowes says, hath annulled the necessity of moral observances. Wesley himself invokes this dreadful emanation in order to try to exorcise it from his own theology. In a famous sermon of 1739 entitled Free Grace, he launches a bitter polemic against the Calvinist doctrine of predestination and election, which, he declares, turns the God of Christianity into a sadistic, hypocritical tyrant. It overturns both his justice, mercy, and truth, Yea, it represents the most holy God as worse than the devil, as both more false, more cruel, and more unjust. The note of hysteria in this pronouncement can only be the signal of Wesley's awareness that the extreme original sin theology that he himself preached was itself based on as drastic a form of predestination as any Calvinist could wish, and was fully as open to the charges he levels here as were the doctrinaire Calvinists themselves. Methodism is haunted, he tells us, by this terrifying figure of a God who is worse than the devil, and who resembles Wesley's own God more closely than he can acknowledge. Wilberforce confronts the same potential crisis of faith from a slightly different angle, disingenuously disavowing his own lineal precursors, the 17th century English Puritans, to whom he refers as the canting hypocrites and wild fanatics of the last century. He observes that Christian bigotry has long used religion to justify cruelty and the persecution of innocents. He evokes the case of, quote, pious Dominicans torturing their miserable victims for the love of Christ, though he might more candidly have referred, say, to John Calvin's burning at the stake of the great humanist scientist Michael Servetus in 1553 for the latter's heresies concerning the doctrines of the Trinity and of infant baptism. Like Wesley in any case, Wilberforce tries to expunge by rhetorical sleight of hand his own deep affiliation with what he identifies as the potential fanatical diabolism of faith. Such are the awkward expedients to which one is driven in preaching the abolition of morality to a deeply moralized country. Of all the numerous Victorian texts in which this motif of the devilish wickedness of God, or of God as a religious fanatic, reappears, the most notable is only English by naturalization. I mean Ludwig Feuerbach's great polemic, The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841 and translated into English in 1854 by George Eliot, who saw it as vitally relevant to understanding the contemporary religious travails of her countrymen. Feuerbach's treatise is notable for its insistence that fanatical moral nihilism, which I'm suggesting is the distinctive theme of the Gothic in its many variant forms, lies at the heart of faith itself, and that this diabolical inhabitant or shadow form of piety appears not as the result of perverse malformations or misunderstandings of Christian belief, but as its very essence. Hence, for instance, his startling analysis of the motto, God is love, which he identifies as the key formulation of Christian moral thought. It is, he declares, for all its seemingly categorical moral affirmativeness, treacherously unstable. Since God appears in it as the positive substantial term, the subject, and love as merely what he terms a collateral, an accident, a mere predicate, the way is open, he says, for a catastrophic disjunction between the two terms. Thus, by the very syntax of the Christian credo, quote, God appears to me in another form besides that of love, says Feuerbach, in the form of omnipotence, of a severe power not bound by love, a power in which the devils participate. So long as love is not exalted into a substance, into an essence, he says further in George Eliot's English, so long there lurks in the background of love an unloving monster, a diabolical being, whose personality, separable and actually separated from love, delights in the blood of heretics and unbelievers, the phantom of religious fanaticism. For Feuerbach, the nihilistic logic of faith materializes itself imaginatively in the form of a vampire-like, unmistakably Gothic devil, who appears in effect as the ghostly double of the God of love. We'll see in a moment how this clue could be extrapolated into an entire Gothic novel. In a later passage in The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach analyzes what he takes to be the inevitable estrangement of religion from humanitarian moral values, and its need to defend itself against those values by striving to annihilate them. From the moment that affirming the existence of God becomes a chief point in religion, Feuerbach says, the moral spirit or disposition of believers necessarily becomes linked to the ideology of moral nihilism. quoting here, "If thou only believest in God, thou art already saved. Whether under this God thou conceivest a really divine being or a monster, a Nero or a Caligula, it is all one. The main point is that thou be not an atheist." The lesson he draws from this latest invocation of the figure of God as the devil is just the one I've been highlighting. "Hitherto it's been badly misunderstood," says Feuerbach. Quoting again, "Atheism was supposed, and is even now supposed, to be the negation of all moral principle, of all moral foundations and bonds. If God is not, all distinction between good and bad, virtue and vice, is abolished." Unquote. But this standard apologia for religion, in which God serves as the fountainhead and underwriter of moral values, gets the dynamic of faith exactly inside out, Feuerbach explains. Quote, "Assuredly, it is not from an attachment to virtue, from a conviction of its intrinsic worth and importance, that the reality of it is thus bound up with the existence of God. On the contrary," he declares in one of his most striking aphorisms, "the belief that God is the necessary condition of virtue is the belief in the nothingness of virtue in itself." Religion is driven not by any desire to strengthen moral foundations and bonds, but rather, Feuerbach tells us, by precisely the opposite, by the negation of all moral principle and by the belief in the nothingness of virtue. The mission of Victorian popular fiction, and notably of George Eliot's own, on the other hand, consisted in the critique of all varieties of this mentality and the attempted reconstruction of a social world based on a fully humanistic morality, which is to say, one created by and for men and women, and thus exempt from the sinister instability and the insidious fanaticism that Feuerbach detects in the statement, "God is love." Hence the frequent imaging in 19th century fiction and nonfiction too of worlds or subworlds exhibiting, as Carlyle phrases it, the almost total extinction of the moral sense. I want now briefly to discuss, after this long preamble, one such text, James Hogg's Private Confessions and Memoirs of a Justified Sinner of 1824. A novel that deserves to be recognized, I think, as maybe the outstanding masterpiece of classic Gothic fiction, as well as the work that arguably exposes more clearly than any other the deep religious thematics of this mode of novel writing. It tells the story of an ultra-Calvinistic evangelical minister named Robert Ringham, who begins having hallucinations of, or actual visitations from, a satanic figure named Gilmartin, who is himself an even more fanatically Calvinistic theologian. Gilmartin, Ringham's doppelganger, or second self as he calls him, preaches above all the antinomian gospel that born-again Christians enjoy immunity from the moral law, and in fact express their religious devotion by their disdain for it. He urges his young disciple not to waste his time preaching, a futile activity anyway, according to a self-consistent Calvinistic theology, and to undertake instead a series of the purificatory killings that so often to all varieties of the fundamentalist mind seem necessary to cleanse society of uncleanness. Ringham suffers qualms of doubt as to whether the moral law against murder is in fact suspended in his case, but infatuated with advanced theories of moral nihilism, like a precocious Raskolnikov 42 years ahead of time, goes ahead anyway. He murders a liberal local preacher, several members of his own family, and a local farmer's daughter he had seduced before going on the run and eventually hanging himself in despair. In other words, the novel enacts a fable of the moral derangement that follows naturally, or so Hogg proposes, from exposure to the toxic effects of original sin theology. What gives this rather starkly simplistic fable its novelistic alchemy is its fusing together of two key tropes. First, the trope of religious moral nihilism as psychosis, and second, the essential Gothic trope of uncanny haunting. As for the first of these, Hogg strikingly prefigures a work that appeared 11 years later, James Powell Pritchard's Treatise on Insanity and Other Disorders Affecting the Mind of 1835. Pritchard purports to diagnose what he claims to be a peculiarly contemporary mental disease, or at least one that has disseminated itself greatly in England, he says, in the previous 30 years, the condition that he terms moral insanity. The victim of this acute psychological and spiritual disorder is of sound mind in all cognitive respects, which to be sure is not necessarily the case for Hogg's hero, Robert Brigham, but exhibits, said Pritchard, quote, a morbid perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, habits, moral dispositions, and natural impulses. His guess is that the alleged recent epidemic of this malady has to do with the decline of wholesome religious influences in contemporary Britain. Hogg, in his novel, suggests that the disorder of the moral faculties identified by Pritchard springs in particular from the crazily flawed logical structure of Calvinistic religious education. The private memoirs and confessions takes then the form of a fictional case history of the religious mania to which the narrator refers more than once as the rage of fanaticism, and which it doesn't take long to recognize as symptomatic of the practice of a religion that, in Fellowes' phrase, hath annulled the necessity of moral observances. We get a concerted analysis of the etiology of religious rage early in Robert's confessional manuscript, as he describes his upbringing by his fundamentalist Presbyterian parents. The religious education he receives is for him a process of becoming progressively unhinged. And the cause of this effect, according to Hogg's analysis, is a set of agonizing contradictions lodged inextricably in the Calvinist system. The unfortunate boy is reared in supposedly wholesome dread of not being among the elect, and of consequently being liable to eternal torment for his hereditary and individual sins. He prays compulsively for deliverance, but his efforts have, weirdly, exactly the opposite effect from that of bringing him nearer to salvation. The more frequently and fervently that I prayed, he reports, I sinned still more. I went on sinning every hour, and all the while most strenuously warring against sin. In this fatalistically sin-obsessed evangelical mentality, battling sin and discovering oneself to be ever more deeply and incurably addicted to it turn out to be one and the same thing. Robert is tormented by this catch-22 of Calvinist piety, which dictates, in obedience to the law that's implicit in all the theology of original sin, that his sins multiply far more rapidly than even the most sincere and zealous repentance could ever catch up with. Since, quote, every unrepented sin was productive of a new sin with each breath that a man drew, unquote, guilt under this regime of compound spiritual indebtedness always and necessarily increases exponentially. By a moderate calculation, Robert reports, his sins amounted to 150,000 in the minute, and I saw no end for the series of repentances to which I had subjected myself. Oh, what a wretched state this unregenerated state is, in which every effort after righteousness only aggravates our offenses, he exclaims, concisely expressing the same vertiginous logic of evangelical spirituality that Wesley and Whitefield had very lucidly expounded long before. Robert's only consolation in this impossible and ludicrous predicament is to take Calvinist theology to heart in its full force. If I could repent me of all my sins and shed tears of blood for them, he realizes at length, still have I not a load of original transgression pressing on me that's enough to crush me to the lowest hell? I may be angry with my first parents for having sinned, but how I shall repent me of their sin is beyond what I'm able to comprehend. This, in effect, is the consolatory inverse of the earlier paradox. Robert discovers, that is, that to follow the injunctions of Wesley, Whitefield, and Wilberforce by fully assuming the burden of original sin is actually to relieve oneself of the intolerable weight of conscience and repentance. Why worry about repenting one's own past sins or striving to suppress one's proneness to sin when inherited sin, for which one bears no personal responsibility and which no repentance can reach, is by itself irrevocably fatal? The sins one may personally commit are, after all, insignificant in the grand computational scheme of salvation. To seek to cleanse oneself of them would almost amount to a deviance from God's plan of grace. Much of the deep logic of Calvinistic antinomian moral nihilism, or rather moral insanity, would seem to be compressed by Hogg here into a couple of lines. Not long afterward, Robert identifies the equally fatal self-discrepancy that nullifies the principle of evangelical ministry itself under the Calvinistic dispensation. He realizes, that is, the uselessness of, quote, haranguing people from the pulpit, striving to produce an effect which God, by his act of absolute predestination, had forever rendered impracticable. The more I pondered on these things, he says, the more I saw of the folly and inconsistency of ministers in spending their lives striving and remonstrating with sinners in order to induce them to do that which they had it not in their power to do. It made the economy of the Christian world appear to me as an absolute contradiction, he memorably declares. The sense of the crazy illogic of piety seems to be what inflames piety itself and drives it to assume ever more extreme nihilistic forms, according to the exacting diagnosis carried out in Hogg's novel. Though Robert in the rest of his tale heaps every kind of sin upon himself, he does not become so much an immoraliste as a passionate despiser of virtue in persons and of moral value as such. The parable of evangelical self-fashioning conducted in this novel lends sharp insight in this way into the bitter aversion to good works that lies at the heart of the evangelical gospel. The fundamentalist Christian is bound to scorn them as Robert does. The preachers up of good works I abhorred, he declares, if only because he realizes his own maddening inability to perform them himself, given what he has discovered to be the exponential logic of sin. The factor of bitter ressentiment in Calvinist zealotry would be hard to overestimate, this novel suggests. By the same token, when Robert announces that the vocation of punishing the wicked and generally being used as a scourge in the hands of the Lord, as he puts it, suits him far better than the futile one of preaching piety, he makes clear that the murderous ferocity that marks all his religious feelings is the product of the absolute contradiction that preys infuriatingly, as he has discovered, on the religious vocation and fills it with its characteristic mood of frustrated rage. It's no less clear that the characteristic punitiveness of the puritanical mentality also expresses in a deeply inverted form the self-hatred that forms its strongest motive of all. Robert will scourge others as a way of vicariously scourging himself for all those rampantly self-multiplying sins to which he confesses with such abject eagerness, or rather, such eagerness for abjection. Such, according to Hogg's novel, is the psychopathological structure of original sin fundamentalism. The theological outcome of Robert's mental disorder is his embrace of the antinomian principle of the infallibility of the elect, and the right, in fact, the Christian duty of believers to despise and deny the moral law. Much theological discourse to this effect is rehearsed in the course of the novel, all of it echoing Calvin's definition of what he called, in a rather sinister phrase, Christian liberty. How I would astonish mankind, Robert thinks, and confound their self-wisdom and their esteemed morality, blow up the idea of any dependence on good works and morality, forsooth. But the main mouthpiece for such dangerous doctrine and for this strain of clinically acute moral insanity is Robert's uncanny alter ego, Gilmartin. The key point here is not so much to decide whether Gilmartin is really the devil in person, a point which literary criticism has debated, as to grasp the rationale of Hogg's decision to cast what has been called his satire of religious wickedness in the form of a Gothic tale of black magic and occult apparitions. Why not make Gilmartin the representative of the devilish potential of Christian belief, an ordinary flesh and blood character, a villainous clergyman of a familiar satirical type? The fundamental reason, I take it, is the same one that's implicit in Feuerbach's analysis of the diabolical being that he calls the phantom of religious fanaticism, and imagines to haunt Christian piety even in its seemingly most humane and benevolent phases. The logic of this entwining of superstitious Gothic imagery with the complex of religious themes I've been tracing could not perhaps be fully explicated until 1919, when Sigmund Freud identified the uncanny as the recurrence of what he called a class of frightening things, which is, as he says, something which is familiar and old-established in the mind and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. In the private memoirs, every element of the tale testifies to a massive return of the repressed. And the repressed of original sin religion, I've been trying to show, is exactly that streak of moral insanity. Or in other words, that fanatical propensity to hate moral virtue that most commonly lurks more or less clandestinely in the background of love. And that even the evangelical preachers sometimes tie themselves in theological knots in seeking to deny in their own creed. The private memoirs and confessions seeks for its part to strip all such equivocation from what Hogg takes to be the devilish moral ideology of the neo-Calvinist revival and the moral revolution it supposedly brought about. In the process, and this is the point to which all this talk boils down, he elucidates the foundational metaphor of Gothic romance by so distinctly identifying the nihilistic Gothic monster as what implicitly this figure always was in his many scary avatars all along, namely the phantom of religious fanaticism.